Hello again. Today I thought to start a new series. For the past 20 years I've been hoping to write a book called Babel in Brooklyn, which brings together a lot of the discoveries I've made over the last 30 or more years about the truth or falsehood of the Watchtower claim that the religion of Christendom is derived, at least in its main teachings, from the Babylon mystery religion. You may know that their source book for this is a book called The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop, and we'll do a video on that particular book and its influence, which is vast, another video. But at this time I wanted to get into one aspect of the research I did over the years, was attached to the claim that Watchtower has had predecessors throughout Christian history, people that taught, at least it is assumed, some of the same things that the Watchtower teaches. And there's a part truth in that. It is generally true that Satan creates nothing. All Satan is capable of doing is distorting truth. So the Watchtower somehow convinces Jehovah's Witnesses that groups like the Bogomils or the Waldenses of medieval times, persecuted small groups, were somehow analogous to the Watchtower, or predecessors of the Watchtower theologically. And the great predecessor, the one that they seem to take the most pride in as a forerunner, as it were, of their theology, is Arius. And so even Christians tend to compare them to Arius in teachings in some aspects. But what was not clear to me, even when I dialogued with Christians on this very subject, was what exactly did Arius teach? This thing called Arianism is oftentimes called the great heresy of the Christian church. And of course that's why the Watchtower picks up on it, because in the 4th century Arius was the great enemy of the Orthodox champion, whose name was Athanasius, from whose name comes the Athanasian Creed, the first clear statement of the Trinity in theological history, some would say. Well, Arius is a very significant figure, but I think even Christians seem to be lacking in perception as to what it was that made Arianism so dangerous to the church. Was it just their lower Christology, or was there something else? So there's lots of books on this subject. This is one that you might be interested in obtaining. I haven't yet read it, but I'm planning to. Arius, Heresy and Tradition by Rowan Williams. You may know that name. He became later Archbishop of Canterbury in the Anglican Church. The one I concentrated on in the 1990s when I was doing my research into Arianism was this: Early Arianism, A View of Salvation. And when I found this book, I was surprised right away, because the subhead was not something I'd thought much about before. It's, according to what I understood from my Watchtower background, Arianism was about Christ and God. That was the center of its dynamic and the reason it was judged so dangerous. But Grow and Greg, in this book, published by Fortress Press, by the way, if it's still in print, I don't know. In this book, Grow and Greg talk about salvation teaching. So I thought I'd concentrate upon that for 2 or 3 segments. Here's what they say about Arianism in general on the Dust Cover. The heart of the early Arian theology rests not in the doctrine of God, but in a scheme of salvation in which the Redeemer brought and modeled the salvation into which all creatures were to grow. The Christology, soteriology, that's doctrine of salvation, and cosmology of Arius and his circle grew out of their conviction that what Scripture said about the Redeemer had to be predicated also of the redeemed. You might say that more simply by saying Christ has to be more like us than he is like God. Now, with that in mind, let's go into some of the development of this thought that Greg and Grow put together. Here's what they say about grace, for instance. What is the Arian view of grace? Now, as you know, in the New World Translation, grace is not translated grace, but rather undeserved kindness, which is not a bad definition. Here's what they say about the view of grace by the Arians of the 4th century. Grace, then, in the Arian scheme, equals the bestowal of divine favor and approval upon obedient, that is virtuous, creatures. So you may be excused for thinking there's some kind of built-in contradiction here. If grace is undeserved kindness or unmerited favor, how then is it something, a bestowal of divine favor and approval upon obedient, virtuous creatures? Don't the words obedient and virtuous imply deserved? We'll go on. Again, they say, indeed, grace as an empowering force could never be so strong as to overcome the free consent of the creature's will. It could never be so weak as to allow the devil to overcome us. Hence, grace, in this sense, implies God's efficient rather than absolute power in a freely cooperating world. Orthodoxy knows a grace which confers sonship on believers, but it never applies this adopting grace to the Christ, as did the Arians. Grace which was conferred meant grace which could not be withdrawn or lost. So this is one of the great distinctions between the theology of Augustine, John Calvin, and the Calvinist strain of the Protestant Church. Grace cannot be rescinded, according to this view of Scripture, whereas this grace could be only applied to those, he says, in a freely cooperating world. So, in other words, you might say that the view of Arius, and I would say Jehovah's Witnesses too, is that man's sovereign will ultimately controls his destiny. Sovereign will of mankind cannot be interrupted or messed around with even by grace. So, from the standpoint of Calvinists in the Augustinian tradition, sovereign grace means God's will be done. Whereas the Arian view of salvation means my will be done. And I've come to learn, and I'll talk about this more in coming videos, that there are really only two types of persons in the universe, two types of beings. One is thy will be done, people, and the other one is my will be done, people. And Arius has written that upon the whole universe by implying that even Christ is subject to at least the potential of deflection. It's possible, therefore, for Christ himself, the Son of God, to deflect from God's will. Well, from the standpoint of orthodoxy, that threw the entire universe, the entire plan of salvation, into chaos. So we'll go on in the next episode to talk about other aspects of the Arian Christ and the Arian soteriology of doctrine of salvation.